Thank you for joining this episode of our webinar series on best practices in e-discovery and digital forensics. Today's session is focused on how to orchestrate a successful investigation to gain an advantage in litigation. With the increasing diversity and varied locations of game-changing evidence, a successful investigation can deliver critical evidence that will make your case. Today you'll hear from a leading private investigator on best practices and strategies for conducting a successful investigation. My name is Jeff Fugit. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Lexbe, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. We've got a lot to cover today, so I'll jump right in. Our webinars take place monthly and cover a variety of relevant e-discovery and digital forensic topics, trends, best practices, and strategies. We've got limited seating, so be sure to register early for the sessions that are of interest to you. If you have technical issues or questions, please email webinars@lexbe.com and we'll address them right away. Our webinars are available online at lexbe.com for viewing via streaming video or downloadable as a PDF presentation or MP3 podcast. You'll find this webinar and a complete listing of other webinars at lexbe.com or on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions during today's session, please enter them in the Q&A portion of the GoToWebinar console, and we'll answer them after the event. To be notified of future live and on-demand events, please email us at webinars@lexbe.com or follow us on LinkedIn. For more than 17 years, Lexbe's been helping legal teams with limited resources handle document-intensive matters. We have the industry's most affordable and full-featured DIY cloud-based e-discovery platform. This includes over 7 artificial intelligence algorithms that assist our clients with their cases. We have the industry's fastest e-discovery processing and document review capability. This is important because being fast means that you have more time to build a stronger case. We deliver the industry's fastest return on investment per a study that was done by G2. We are also rated as the e-discovery company that's the easiest to do business with, as well as a high performer, the easiest to administer, and having the best customer support. If you'd like a demonstration of our platform, simply email us at sales@lexbe.com and we'll get that scheduled. Joining us today is Ryan Bittle. Ryan is the president of Alert Investigations. He is a licensed private investigator who specializes in serving law firms. He has a focus on personal injury, business litigation, and IP litigation. Prior to founding Alert Investigations, Ryan was an investigator for the state regulatory agency in California, where he investigated criminal, civil, and administrative cases. He is a certified fraud examiner, a certified forensic interviewer, an active member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, as well as the International Association of Interviewers, and the California Association of Licensed Investigators. Before I turn it over to Ryan, I'm going to ask for your participation in a polling question. And our first polling question is, in what percentage of your cases do you conduct an investigation? And while you're answering that, I'll thank you for participating in our polling questions today. All right. Looks like a couple more are coming in. And I'll go ahead and close that poll. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ryan Bittle. Ryan?
Thanks, Jeff. So today we're going to be talking about how to orchestrate a successful investigation to gain an advantage in litigation. So there's going to be a few things that we're going to talk about. If you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A. But first, we're going to talk about the role of a private investigator in litigation. I'm aware that some of you may use private investigators all the time. Some of you may never use private investigators or only use them in rare circumstances. We're also going to talk about what types of cases are best suited for private investigators and why, what type of evidence can be collected, best practices in working with private investigators, and limitations of private investigators. So as I go through this, if anyone has any questions, please put it in the Q&A and we'll try to get them answered after the session. So when we talk about the role of a private investigator, I always say there's really two parts of it, the pre-litigation and litigation, but there's also the post-litigation phase, potentially any appeals that are going on that are important. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to just talk about pre-litigation and litigation. The private investigator is very simply put your fact finder. That's all they do. They're not there to make your case. They're not there to prove the other side is wrong or that your side is right. They're there to identify the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's to allow you to, as the attorney or as the law firm, to apply the law to the facts that were gathered. I always say this, that every once in a while, private investigators will get an attorney that says, well, I want you to get the witness to say this. And that's not what a private investigator is there for. We're there to just get the facts, and that's it. However, the law gets applied to those facts, whether the information that we find can be utilized in the particular matter, that's dependent upon the laws which you have to apply to the facts. In a pre-litigation standpoint, everyone's guard is down. Oftentimes, we can call someone and they're willing to talk, but the second that everyone knows that litigation is occurring, people stop talking, and everything has to go through legal process. This is potentially unrepresented witnesses that I'm referring to. Is once they know that there's actual litigation occurring, people don't want to get involved. They are afraid they're going to get subpoenaed. They don't want to be involved. So pre-litigation is always a very important time for an investigation to occur. It also allows you to identify various evidence. This could be digital evidence. This could be physical evidence. This could be pictures of a scene. It could be many different things, but all this, when everyone's notified that litigation is occurring, sometimes miraculously just disappears. Always interesting. That's obviously not supposed to happen, but if we don't preserve it in the pre-litigation investigation, sometimes you'll never know that it disappeared, or you'll never be able to prove that it disappeared. A lot of witnesses in a lot of matters will only want to be talked to so many times before they give up, especially if they maybe aren't an employee of either party, where they don't have to necessarily cooperate. So potentially you have one shot only to talk to this witness before they don't ever want to talk to you again. That they put their 2 cents in, that they tried, or that they were told by their spouse or a friend just not to get themselves involved. So pre-litigation is a great time to get in there and identify those witnesses and try to interview them. During the litigation cycle, when both sides discover everything, when discovery happens, both sides know exactly what the other side has. Well, when you hire a private investigator, we always say that you have an advantage over the opposing side because you have more facts than them. You may know more about internet presence. You may know more mitigating facts. You may know more facts that support the defense or the offense. So having a private investigator, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. Private investigators in most states enjoy the privilege of attorney work product, as we're working as your agent as an attorney. It ends up becoming attorney work product. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides, but that's really the role of your private investigator. It all is summarized to, we find facts, and we try to find the facts that you didn't know were there before. And I can give you a million examples, but quite simply, I'm just coming up with this off the top of my head. If you had a litigation involving, let's say, a roofing company, you know all the facts because it was done through discovery, it was done through the initial litigation procedures and processes that you determined all the facts that you know of. But once you hire a private investigator, you're able to potentially locate former employees, potentially locate former homeowners who had roof repair work done on them, and interview them and find out information that neither side knew existed that could greatly benefit your position. So when I say cases best suited for private investigators, quite frankly, they're beneficial in every single case that you're working. And this is where most attorneys use private investigators. It's for skip tracing, difficult process serves. Those are really the two most common ways that are used. And even the attorneys that almost never use private investigators, when they can't find someone to be served, the first thing they want to do is call a private investigator and do skip tracing. That's like the most basic form of private investigations. If you're doing that, you're not really at an advantage. I will say that a lot of private investigators are really good at skip tracing. A lot of private investigators are really good at doing difficult process serves. And when I say difficult process serves, I'm talking about the person that either doesn't want to be found or just lives a lifestyle that makes it difficult for them to be found. They're not necessarily hiding, they're just difficult to find. A private investigator is going to do significantly higher quality job than a process serving company, and that's because a process serving company goes off of volume. They want to serve or attempt service on 40 to 50 serves a day potentially, which is why they offer relatively cheap services. If you have something that needs to be done today, tomorrow, and you need it to be done right in the first time, my recommendation is hire a private investigator for that. Witness statements, I always say the good, the bad, the ugly. I talk about sworn statements. Some states this matters. I know we have attorneys from all over. In a lot of states, if you're a public notary, you can take a sworn statement, and that sworn statement is beneficial. As an example, I know in several states in the personal injury world, it would be beneficial to have a sworn statement for the purposes of defending hearsay objections in certain motions that are filed. There are several ways that you can get the sworn statement that will be beneficial to your case. So it doesn't have to be sworn. Most of the time it's not. However, in California, as an example, we don't do very many sworn statements. I know some of my New York counterparts, they do sworn statements all the time. The other thing that we can do is witness backgrounds. Witness backgrounds are extremely important. And when I say witness backgrounds, I'm not talking about necessarily the other side's backgrounds, but also your witness backgrounds. If you're working a plaintiff case, your own plaintiff, if you're working on a contingency basis, wouldn't it be helpful to know your credibility issues with the plaintiff before you and personally invest, several thousand, tens of thousands of dollars into a case? So we could definitely do that. If we could look into the background information on witnesses on the opposing side, look for credibility issues, criminal history, potentially people that don't necessarily like that witness that will provide pretty damaging testimony to their credibility. We can also do witness statements and backgrounds to rehabilitate a witness's credibility. So it just kind of depends on exactly what you're looking for and what the purpose of the background is. But we can definitely, and every private investigator who works with attorneys can do a witness background. This isn't a simple pre-employment background. This is a deep dive, and a presidential candidate, as an example, goes through a background check, and they hire private investigations firms, and they spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars doing a background check. So you could get as expensive as a presidential level background check to make sure that the political party is willing to support this particular candidate, that they don't have a background that is going to harm their platform, or get as cheap as a quick database search background check. I definitely don't recommend doing just a database search. You need a little bit more than that, doing public record searches, potentially sending people actually to the courthouse, law enforcement records through the public records requests, all that good stuff. Corporate counsel, oftentimes, well, and these are just, I'm going to give you just a few examples of attorneys that may be on this webinar that'd be useful, with the understanding that I think it's beneficial in all cases, but in these particular niches of law, these particular areas of practice, this is when it's particularly important. So for corporate counsel, any internal investigations where litigation is likely, you have that sexual harassment or workplace violence or some other type of incident that occurred that you believe that litigation is likely, it might be very important to hire a neutral third party to conduct this investigation. And they have the benefit of working under you, so they enjoy the privilege of attorney work product and attorney-client privilege. Any internal, external threats, if corporate counsel gets involved in threats involving C-suite level executives, it could be internal employee threats, insider threats, or external threats. Due diligence, this is a big one. There's a lot of very specialized firms that just do this, and then any private investigator can likely do this. This is a little specialized though, which is why there's very large firms that they only do corporate due diligence. And due diligence would be a vendor due diligence, making sure that they are not involved or have bad publicity so that your company doesn't necessarily have bad publicity because they're doing business with this person. Due diligence can be mergers or acquisitions, looking at maybe what the public sentiment profile is on them, previous civil lawsuits, criminal violations of the board, anything that involves that. It could also go as far in the niche specialty of doing supply chain, ethical supply chain due diligence, where there's potentially a private investigator going to Africa or South America or Europe to do an on the ground inspection of the supply chain to make sure that your corporation that you're representing isn't necessarily involved in child labor or forced labor or any type of labor exploitation. So those are ways that maybe corporate counsel might particularly use private investigators that other attorneys might not. And plaintiff personal injury and insurance defense. So the insurance industry is probably the most well-known industry that uses private investigators. Every private investigator has done an insurance defense case at some point. It's when you first start out, if you want to start making money as a private investigator, you just have to contact one of those national private investigations companies and they will start giving you overflow work immediately. So every private investigator has done insurance defense work. Insurance companies spend a lot of money on private investigators, and thus so do insurance defense law firms. So where it's commonly done is we're doing scene inspections, we're locating evidence, as well as the typical witness statements. Another common one in the insurance defense world is doing surveillance of the plaintiff or of the claimant to determine, and this is what everyone, when they imagine a private investigator, what they think. You're sitting outside the house with a camera, a video camera, and recording the plaintiff or the claimant to make sure that they're not using their right arm, and they catch them with a video of playing catch baseball with their child, and that proves that maybe the injury isn't as extensive as they claimed it was. So that's the most common stereotypical, I guess, job that a private investigator does. There is much more to it. While that's extremely important evidence, that is a surveillance is a specific niche inside of private investigations. And I would say about 50% of private investigators only do surveillance and they really don't do work outside of surveillance. So, and I'll talk about this in the future. When you are engaging a private investigator, make sure that they have some type of experience in your niche, or if they don't have experience in that particular area of practice, that you at least feel comfortable that their skill set, they can easily work in that. And I say that because a lot of the times a surveillance investigator has never interviewed someone or never had to have that conversation with a person, which is way different than sitting in your car for 10 hours waiting for someone to come out. So just some thoughts there. And intellectual property, most common one here is internet investigations, attempting to locate websites that are potentially selling counterfeit products, or businesses or persons that are using intellectual property type assets. This could be undercover operations in person, going into storefronts and purchasing counterfeit products. It could be doing surveillance, following vehicles back to a warehouse that has counterfeit products. Could be purchasing these either at the store or online. All types of different intellectual property investigations occur. This is a pretty specialized area in the private investigations world. There are private investigations firms that all they do is intellectual property work. There are also plenty of private investigators that don't necessarily spend their entire time on intellectual property, but they're pretty knowledgeable on it. So there's many different avenues that you can use when you have a case for private investigators. I'll say that if there's any plaintiff personal injury attorneys on this webinar, oftentimes I find that they underutilize private investigators. And I'll just say that when you don't use private investigators as a plaintiff personal injury or any type of plaintiff attorney, whether that's on workers' comp or anything else that's a contingency basis, you are at a major disadvantage because that insurance company is hiring private investigators. So you need to too. someone always told me, or one law firm always told me, and they always say it, that if you aren't using a private investigator, you're leaving money on the table. So that was from a very large personal injury plaintiff law firm. So when we talk about what evidence PIs can collect, when it comes to witness statements, there is some strategy to this, and this depends on particular discovery laws in your particular state. I, in California, will almost always take audio recorded witness statements. I know there are some states where the attorneys do not want audio recorded statements. They do not want written reports. They only want verbal briefings because of the specific laws require any written report by an investigator to be discovered and sent to the other side. So there's some strategy behind it about only providing verbal briefings about what someone said. In California, there is some case law that does state that the private investigator's work is an attorney product, a work product, and anything that the client says is also protected by attorney-client privilege, as we are working as an agent of the attorney. So surveillance, this is kind of what I talked about before. This is the most common use of a PI and a type of evidence. This is usually a camcorder or still photos. It's extremely moving evidence to see. It also builds a story and allows the storytelling to be that much more important. I'll just say that sometimes surveillance does have a negative public relations backlash. And there was and just recently, some of the surveillance backlash that I can give is, there was a large company who one of the board members hired a private investigator to surveil another board member who he suspected of doing something that he wasn't supposed to as a board member. Well, the private investigator ended up collecting days worth of video of this board member just going on walks around his neighborhood and being the most normal person you could be, but it then became public, and it was an extremely damaging event from a public relations standpoint that this corporation was hiring private investigators to spy on other people in the corporation. So there is some potentially negative public relations, or the jury or the judge may not like exactly the tactics that are used, so keep that in mind. That's very well accepted in the insurance defense world to do that, but maybe not in other practices or in other jurisdictions. Background evidence, we talked about this. Mostly it's usually used to challenge a witness credibility or know what potentially your witnesses can be challenged on. So if you are planning on calling a witness, to understand what their background is, so you are well aware and you can preempt potentially credibility issues and maybe attempt to rehabilitate them before their credibility is attacked. We can locate previously unknown internet activities and preserving them. So what I mean by this is you have a person that you're attempting to locate online. You want to locate all their social media accounts. There are plenty of strategies that exist out there and we call it OSINT, just stands for open source intelligence, that can be utilized to locate these previously unknown social media accounts. And sometimes these are social media accounts that the person that owns them forgot about, that they signed up a Reddit account, or they signed up on MySpace or Twitch, Pinterest, something that they may not use very often, and they totally forgot that they even had an account there. And you're able to find information about them on a post on Reddit 5 years ago that contradicts what they're saying today, or potentially allows you to challenge their credibility. So it's not just locating them, but it's also preserving them forensically. What's really important is that we do preserve them forensically. And what I mean by that is, and I'll just say this as I've constantly run across attorneys who are not knowledgeable on this particular area, is you cannot just screenshot a page and put it in a PDF document or print it off. There has to be metadata that's collected in order for it to be authenticated properly. I would look into your local court rules and your state's evidence code, because it does change from state to state, but pretty much universally, you need metadata in order to authenticate screenshots. So to do that, there's plenty of forensic firms out there, a lot of private investigators do it. As an example, I invested a lot of money in technology and software that can preserve social media accounts and websites to do it properly. So just keep that in mind when you're out there. If you just get a PDF document back with screenshots, that might be great to copy and paste into a motion to provide some visuals, but in terms of being able to authenticate it in court, you may be challenged there. Using various investigative techniques, we can link websites together. As an example, this can be done through Google AdWords codes. This can be done through affiliate codes that are all on websites that are within the code of the website, and just generally following their online profile, which will give you a significant amount more information. Some people are all over the internet, and there's other people that aren't all over the internet. And that's because they either are purposefully isolating themselves on various websites they're on so they can't be identified, or they just do it without even thinking and it makes it near impossible to follow them. You really don't know until you try. Locating assets, this is another very common type of evidence that PIs collect. This is oftentimes when you're trying to recover a judgment or just no pre-litigation of like what assets does this person even have if you're trying to go over policy limits or other types of litigation, would be locating their assets. This could be real property, this could be vehicles, this could be boats, potentially bank accounts. I'll say that bank accounts are a really iffy place to go. A lot of private investigators, in my opinion, and in many of my other colleagues' opinions, violate the law and how they gather that information. If you ask your private investigator where you got this information from, they should be able to provide you that information. And you, as an attorney, can't just turn a blind eye about how this information is being gathered. Every year, there is a private investigator who gets federally indicted for violating federal laws and accessing bank account information. And I would imagine as an attorney, you don't want your name to be associated with that private investigator. So if you're going to hire someone to locate bank accounts, there are some ways to do it legitimately. It'll never be 100% successful, but there are plenty of private investigators out there who violate the law, in my opinion, as well as my opinion of some others. So in terms of images, something that I've recently started doing that I have found that's really useful is drone and aerial imagery. Drone footage is, in my opinion, way underutilized right now, and it works great to provide jury appeal. It works great to provide initial observations that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get. Example, if you're questioning how vehicles move through an intersection, what the normal vehicle pattern and movement patterns are, you can put a drone up over an intersection for 30 minutes and get 30 minutes of overhead footage of how cars are merging, how cars are turning, and how cars are going through the light. You can inspect various infrastructure that you maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to inspect or physically get to. And then in terms of just videos, this is videos on the ground or pictures on the ground, the typical images that you'd take of a scene. What's also becoming more and more common is 3D scans of scenes. This would allow you to basically do a 3D tour. If you guys have ever done a 3D tour at a house that maybe you were looking to purchase, some houses or some realtors will do a 3D scan of the interior of a house so you can go tour a house in another state. You don't have to physically be there. The same concept is you can do a 3D scan of a scene that you're interested in, and then later you can go walk through that scene a million times without ever having to be there. Something that's becoming more and more used, also beneficial to show a jury. So another big one, and this is one private investigator, he called it this, and I love this term, is they call it their silver bullet, and that's finding unrepresented and previously unknown witnesses. Obviously, you can't interview a represented witness without their attorney being there. So when it comes to businesses, oftentimes finding that unrepresented witness because they no longer work there, that they may be quit, they're now unemployed, or they're working for another employer, being able to interview that person is extremely, extremely important, because likely they're not going to be included in the discovery and their statement was likely never taken. But this could be to show patterns, biases, credibility issues, just how a business ran on a day-to-day basis, just a lot of information that may point you in the right direction, or they might become the star witness to be able to prove your theory in a case. And this same thing, previously unknown witnesses, doing neighborhood canvases, depending on the area, talking to neighbors of potentially witnesses. The world is the limit here in terms of what we can collect and who we want to talk to, and it just depends on your particular style. All right, so talking about best practices working with private investigators. We'll first start off with like licensed, unlicensed investigators. Each state has different licensing requirements. Some states that don't require any licensing for private investigators include Colorado and Alaska, California, Texas, Florida, New York, some of the biggest states. They all require a licensed You have to get a license to become an investigator, and there's specific requirements. You have to have so many years of experience working in investigations before you can be your own licensed investigator. With that, understand that it is defined on what is considered a private investigator and what is not based off the activities one conducts. So they may not call themselves an investigator, they may call themselves a consultant, but if they're interviewing witnesses, if they are doing other activities and maybe they're not a licensed professional, very likely that they are considered a private investigator, even if they're not calling themselves a private investigator. There is, every once in a while, you'll see there'll be a news article that will talk about an attorney who hired an unlicensed investigator and the entire case was discredited or the evidence that was gathered was inadmissible. So make sure you're using licensed investigators. Very simply, too, an attorney needs to retain the investigator, not the attorney's client. When I have private clients call me saying they want an investigator, the first question I always ask them is, do you have an attorney? And if they do, I tend to end the conversation and just want to talk with the attorney. This protects that particular client to make sure that they are not necessarily telling me information that wouldn't otherwise be protected. This is because the investigator acts as your agent. I've talked about this several times in this webinar. I think it's extremely important that in most states, the investigator does have attorney work product privileges, that they are basically creating work product on your behalf, and therefore it's attorney work product. Analogy that I like to use is that the attorney is the coach calling the plays, and the investigator is the quarterback that's putting those plays into practice. And what I mean by that is that your investigator will have those contacts to put your plays into practice, into action when you're calling them out. So you're coordinating roughly the entire case, but your investigator is the one that's actually getting out there and doing the work. So your investigator may not be able to do it all on their own. They may have to hire another investigator or a specialist. Then they should be able to do that, and you should trust them to be able to do that. Understanding that you are there as a coach and you are in the loop with everything that's occurring. So I love to use this analogy on task-based investigators versus investigators. I will give props to the insurance defense industry. They are the ones that created task-based investigators. I'll use an example that recently happened to me about the difference between task-based investigators versus an investigator. So I had another private investigator contact me who needed assistance, that they were out of the area geographically and they needed help on an area in the middle of nowhere, and they wanted to go check if video surveillance was there, and they were going to pay me a flat fee to go do it. I looked on Google Maps and I noticed that there were several houses, and the purpose of it is, my understanding is there was like a child that was hit by a car or something of that nature in this intersection. It was a personal injury or insurance defense type matter. Well, they wanted to check if there was video surveillance in this intersection, and that was what they were wanting to pay the flat fee. I saw a bunch of houses around the area that all had porches on them, and it was likely that if you were to do a neighborhood canvas, that someone may have saw something. And the response was that nope, this particular fee is only for video surveillance, checking for video surveillance. They're not paying for any neighborhood canvas. In that particular case, I actually didn't take this job. I turned it down. But this is the difference between a task-based investigator and an investigator. A task-based investigator is very simply doing exactly what they're being told, and an investigator is looking at the big picture. Why are we getting video surveillance? Well, it's because we want to know what happened. Well, what are other ways to know what happened? You don't want to get an investigator who just ignores the obvious when they're out there. This does require trust between you and your investigator. But I always tell my clients that if I have to be on scene for an extra 2 or 3 hours that was unplanned because I hit a gold mine of a witness that I want to interview, I would expect them to support me in that. That even though it's going to cost a little bit of extra money that maybe wasn't planned, that it's really important that if we happen to run into something along the way, that I don't just ignore it. But it's also how I run my business as a private investigator. From the onset is how I run. I don't do task-based or flat fees to avoid that from happening. So you have specialized investigators versus general investigators. Specialized investigators are great when it's exactly what you need. And by specialized investigators, there are investigators out there that only will do internet investigations. There are investigators that will only do due diligence, corporate due diligence. There are investigators that will only do corruption financial investigations that are extremely niched and specialized investigators. However, that internet investigator may not be willing to go out and do a witness statement. That's not what they do. That they don't do that. So I always recommend that if you have a large enough volume to have that relationship with a specialized investigator, do it, because the specialized investigators are really, really good. But generally speaking, for the vast majority of law firms and attorneys, I recommend going with a general investigator, someone who is able and willing to do a little bit of everything, but also someone that's willing to know when they don't necessarily have the expertise in a particular area, and they will hire a specialized investigator to work on the case with them. That's the best way to do it. As an investigator, I know who all the specialized investigators are throughout the country, and that's my network that I have, and I know who I'm going to pull in for specific cases. So I would consider myself more of a general investigator. I do have a vast knowledge on internet investigations and social media investigations. I have that specialty, but I'm still a general investigator. That's not all I do. I do a bunch of other stuff as well. You should always brief your investigator on the type of work that they're going to be doing. And what's common, this goes back to the task-based investigator, is if I'm getting an interview or if I'm being told to interview John Smith, I may get 1 or 2 pages of discovery to kind of brief me on what I should be asking John Smith, but I don't understand the entire case. You don't necessarily, some of these cases would take days or weeks to brief someone. You don't necessarily have to give them that much information, but you definitely should give them a 15-minute speech on the case facts. And this is just important. So the investigator knows what they're looking for and what they're asking for, and that they don't leave any stone unturned. I always talk about a fact wish list, and this is if you can have in your perfect case as an attorney, whether it's defense or plaintiff work or respondent or any other type of case, that you have this, like, in the perfect world, these would be your facts. And you should share that with your investigator with the understanding that we don't want to force these facts to happen. We're not going to craftily ask questions to manipulate a witness to say something that they wouldn't otherwise say, because that would be unethical. But that we do want to know what this wish list is, because we should be on the lookout for it and ask those specific questions. Because if I didn't realize that the insurance firm really wanted to know who owned the crane on site, and they wanted to in their back pocket to go after that crane as being a responsible party. Well, if I didn't know that that was their plan, I may not ask that question. Whereas now that I know that, I can go into a lot of line of questioning about who owns that crane, what's the function of that crane on the job site. I can go into all this information that I wouldn't have otherwise known to do. Maybe that I wasn't prioritized on that. The best investigators will always need to know why they're doing something. It always works out better when they know why. I had one of my attorney clients tell me that sometimes you can sound like a toddler asking why. Why do you want me to go ask this particular question? Knowing why allows us to ask questions maybe in a different way than was originally planned based on how we're reading that particular witness. So some witnesses will shut down right away, other witnesses are willing to talk, and you just have to go with the flow and be very fluid to be able to get those information out. So I'll also say that not every investigator works well with every legal professional. Not every attorney that calls me or I interact with is someone that I want to do business with, and not every attorney wants to do business with me. And it just depends on how you work and how that investigator works. So just understand that it's a two-way streak. I always want my attorneys to the attorneys that I work with to trust me and be able to allow me to go investigate within the general budgetary requirements. That there's some cases where all that can be budgeted is a single interview and they can't do anything else. And there's other cases where the budget is there and they have to trust me without them micromanaging me because they don't want to take phone calls from me in the field every 5 minutes to be able to just go out and investigate and provide them with all the facts. So there are some attorneys that don't want to work that way, and that's fine. There are plenty of investigators who are task-based investigators if that's what you're looking for. It's kind of up to you and how you work, and it's up to the investigator, and you guys may do one or two cases together and then find that you're not a good match and you guys can move on, potentially even refer you to somebody else. So just always be looking for your investigator, someone that you want to work with on a regular basis. Some limitations of private investigators. I always say beware the private investigator that does it all. And what I'm referring to is the private investigator that also does process serving, court running, and pre-employment drug testing. What are some other things? I've even seen private investigators doing transcriptions. All of these things that have nothing to do with private investigations. You are finding someone who maybe only does 30% of their time do they actually do private investigation work. So you're not getting an expert. So with that, know your experience of your investigator. Beware of the optics of the investigative techniques that you're using. This is such as physical surveillance. If you're considering using GPS trackers, really consider that. As an example, that was completely legal in the state of Nevada, and a private investigator put a tracker on the mayor's vehicle, the Reno's mayor put a tracker on her vehicle. No laws were violated, but the public outcry that someone was being tracked by a private investigator was so severe that the law changed within less than a year. So now it's against the law to put trackers on people's cars. So I usually would recommend never putting trackers on anybody's cars. Use other surveillance techniques. So just understand the optics of every investigation that you do and make sure the optics are to your mission and what you're trying to accomplish. Probably some private investigators do not have a solid understanding of the law. I'm not an attorney. I learn something new every day. I don't speak like an attorney and I don't try to speak like an attorney. I try to speak very like a layperson, but I also like to try to understand the law, that I'm like the reasons why I'm doing something and to make sure that I'm following within the guidelines of the law. And the reason why this is important is because there's some basic legal things that an investigator should never do. They should never lie. They should never misrepresent themselves or otherwise violate ethical guidelines attorneys must follow. If you're hiring a private investigator, they are your agent. If that investigator does something they shouldn't be doing and they misrepresent themselves, it's not going to only come back on the investigator, but it's also going to come back on the attorney. There are limited exceptions, and this is your decision to make as the attorney on the case of when maybe you can friend somebody on Facebook or do undercover operations. There are very limited exceptions to this, and it's commonly in the anti-counterfeiting world where you can conduct undercover operations where you're interacting with various people. But in general, if your investigator doesn't know when they're working, if they don't work with attorneys very often and they leave out the fact they're working with a law firm, that can be a very big deal because they're misrepresenting themselves, or that they misrepresent themselves as a police officer or misrepresent themselves as working for the opposing party. All very common to do if the private investigator doesn't know what they're doing. And that leads to the final point is investigators cannot violate the law. An investigator is a normal person who is licensed to do the investigation. Common that's done is a common violation of the law is trespassing. So trash pulls are illegal depending upon the local and state ordinances and laws. Like example, the city that I live in, when the trash goes out to the sidewalk for the garbage truck to pick up, it is illegal to go through that trash. But in the city over, there is no law that says that you can't go through trash that's output on the public right of way. So with that, I can't pull the trash in my city, but in the city over, I can pull up next to that trash can and take the trash out and go through it at a later time. Why that might not be important, there could be some really interesting information in that trash can. There could be information on bank accounts, hidden assets, all that good stuff. You can find a whole lot in trash pulls. One of the reasons why law enforcement does it all the time. However, you have to understand the trespass laws and the various city ordinances. Violating wiretapping laws, this is very common. A lot of this happens in one party or two or all party consent states for audio recording. California is a two-party state, or I guess be more accurately, an all-party state. Everyone has to consent or know that they're being audio recorded. You can't secretly record people. Investigators need to understand when they can and when they can't do that. And the other one, which thankfully hasn't been happening much lately, but this was very common in the 90s and early 2000s. It was impersonating law enforcement, was pretending to be a police officer in order to get the information you wanted, whether that was from banks, whether that was from businesses for like video surveillance or whatnot. You can't do that. Investigators cannot violate the law, and you definitely don't want it being on the record at any point or it written in a motion that it's being argued that your investigator like willfully and blatantly violated the law. Does not look good for your case, does not look good for the investigator, and does not look good for the attorney. So with all that, that wraps up just about everything that I have on orchestrating a successful investigation to gain an advantage in litigation. If you have any questions, please write them in chat and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. I really love the strategies for identifying game-changing evidence from creative sources and previously unknown witnesses, as well as how to avoid those investigative potholes. At Lexbe, we help law firms and enterprises address the forensic collections and e-discovery, including evidence from social media accounts, videos, and evidence uncovered from your investigations. We provide comprehensive remote and on-site forensic collections that are fully defensible. We utilize industry-leading tools like Celebrate and Magnet Forensics. We handle a very wide range of device and account types, as you can see on this partial list. And now I'd like to ask our next polling question. Do you have a forensic collection project, and would you like a complimentary consult? All right, I'll close that poll. We work with a lot of boutique law firms, and when they come to us, they often have some combination of these issues. I don't have enough time to build my case. I'm afraid I'll be outgunned by the opposing counsel. Our team has limited technical competency. We have a limited e-discovery budget. This case involves millions of documents, and we have a relatively small staff. So we're seeing some of these magnified in the current economic environment where many of our boutique firm clients are experiencing strong growth at the expense of big law. Enterprises are working to cut legal services costs, and many of our clients are in growth mode and leverage us extensively to help address these issues and the challenges of handling document-intensive cases. This is what we do. Our platform is lightning fast, and it gives you the time you need to build a strong case. We get you from document ingestion to review faster and get your productions out the door faster. We're the most affordable e-discovery solution on the market. We'd be happy to provide you with a competitive estimate for your next case. We have an advanced digital forensics lab to assist with evidence acquisition, as well as an ACED certified professional services staff consisting of lawyers and litigation paralegals that can assist you on a moment's notice. And we have advanced artificial intelligence algorithms to help streamline the process and give you the time you need to build that strong case. David Jones was concerned that he would be outgunned by his AmLaw opposition. He quickly realized that Lexbe was a great equalizer and helped him build his best case that delivered a winning verdict. Paige Tackett at Thompson Co. needed Lexbe speed to get some productions out the door to meet deadlines. As I mentioned, Lexbe is lightning fast and gets you from document ingestion to productions faster. Patrick Biggins needed an easy-to-use e-discovery platform to handle document-intensive cases for a boutique law firm. Lexbe got him onboarded fast and provided the support they needed to build a strong case. With Lexbe's e-discovery platform hosted at Amazon Web Services, you get on-demand capabilities that scale to address the needs of your case. With Lexbe's cloud infrastructure, you can get from document ingestion to review faster and get your productions out the door faster. All of your remote or mobile connected employees can access the Lexbe e-discovery platform via a web browser. Works great on Macs, PCs, iPhones, and Android devices, although I wouldn't recommend doing an intensive document review on an iPhone. That'd be quite the eye strain there. But it gives you unprecedented flexibility and efficiency. And I wanted to point out that Lexbe is a single end-to-end e-discovery platform. Unlike many e-discovery providers, you don't have to move your data from one solution to another. Lexbe has fully integrated processing, document review, analytics, case timelining, artificial intelligence, and production capabilities. We easily handle the smallest of cases to the largest of cases and scale infinitely. At Lexbe, you also get the latest in AI algorithms that help you quickly navigate massive data sets, maintain control of your cases, and gain the time you need to build a strong case. I like to call this evidentiary intelligence. So Lexbe AI algorithms perform multimedia file transcription and search, language translation, sentiment analysis, entity detection, image recognition to automatically categorize those photos, predictive coding, near duplication groupings, document comparison, and much more. At Lexbe, we continue to innovate the Lexbe Discovery platform, which not only means your subscription continuously improves, but we're also creating new efficiencies and pass the cost savings on to customers. That's why we don't have to charge you for processing, file promotion, early case assessment, user fees, OCR, productions. We don't nickel and dime you with electronic endorsement charges, and we save you money on the hosting as well. If you've got clients that are trying to cut their legal services spend due to the recessionary climate, then you should experience a demo. It only takes 10 minutes and you'll see what you've been missing. We give you more time to build a strong case by getting you from document ingestion to review faster, and we get your productions out the door faster. And with that, I'll ask our last polling question. Would you like a demo of the Lexbe e-discovery platform? While you're answering that, I'd like to thank you for attending today's session. We'll be making the following available to webinar attendees: a recorded streaming version, an MP3 podcast, as well as a PDF. Please let us know if you have any questions or comments about this webinar or suggestions for future topics. This webinar is part of the Lexbe Discovery webinar series. For notices of future live and on-demand webinars as part of this series, please email us at webinars@lexbe.com or follow us on LinkedIn. Also, we'd like your advice regarding our webinar series. Please complete the survey at the end of today's session. It helps us continuously improve this program and cover the digital forensic and e-discovery topics that are most relevant to you. And with that, I'd like to thank Ryan for presenting today, and thank you for attending. Be sure to follow Lexbe on LinkedIn so you'll be alerted to the latest podcasts and webinar episodes. And watch your inbox for an invite to our next webinar on best practices in e-discovery and digital forensics. Take care.